Hello, I am Sean Whitaker, 32 years old, living in Denver, Colorado. I am a software engineer working for a small but ambitious tech startup. At first glance, my life seems ordinary. A compact apartment in downtown Denver, long days writing code, and evenings jogging along the South Platte River to relieve stress. But if you ask me about my family, about what led me to where I am today, the story becomes far more complicated. It starts with my grandfather, Robert Whitaker, who left me a legacy worth $4 million. $3 million in assets and $1 million in insurance. But that money wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was keeping it, when my entire family, from my father Michael to my uncle Richard, wanted to tear it apart like vultures. I grew up in Denver, in a comfortable log house in the suburbs where cold winds from the Rocky Mountains swept through every evening. My mother left when I was young, leaving me with my father, Michael, and vague memories of her perfume. My father wasn't a bad man, but he had a fatal flaw: gambling. I remember the nights he came back from Las Vegas, his eyes bloodshot, reeking of alcohol and cigarettes. He'd sit at the kitchen table muttering about luck just around the corner while counting the few coins he had left. Once, I saw him cry. His head slumped on the table, a crumpled stack of betting tickets beside him. I was only 10, and I already knew my father never won. My uncle Richard, my father's younger brother, was different. He lived in a completely different world from ours. A world of shiny cars, hilltop mansions, and lavish parties he loved to flaunt on social media. Richard was an entrepreneur, always talking about his business empire. But I soon realized that empire was just a pile of debts masked by fake smiles and expensive watches. He had a knack for making people believe he was successful. But I always sensed something was off. When I was 15, he showed up at our house in a brand new Bentley, inviting my father to invest in a surefire project. My father handed over nearly all his savings and, of course, never saw a dime of it back. At the heart of my family's story is my grandfather, Robert Whitaker, a man I both admired and pitied. He was the CEO of a prestigious financial conglomerate in the 1980s, a man who could silence a boardroom with a single glance. My grandfather was a man of discipline, of ironclad principles, but he also carried deep emotional wounds he kept hidden. My grandmother passed away when my father was young, and though he never said it aloud, my grandfather always blamed himself for not spending enough time with his two sons. To make up for it, he gave them everything they wanted: money, cars, yachts, and extravagant vacations. But this only led my father deeper into gambling and left Uncle Richard living a lavish but hollow life. I remember the weekends when I was a kid, when my grandfather would pick me up from my father's house and take me to his corporate office. It was a towering glass building in downtown Denver where everyone wore sharp suits and talked in numbers. I, a 10-year-old kid with messy hair, would sit in a leather chair in his office watching him work. He'd hand me a pen and a notebook, telling me to write down what you think is important. I didn't understand finance back then, but I loved how he explained things, simply, clearly, as if he were telling a story. "Sean," he'd say, "money isn't the goal. It's just a tool. If you don't know how to use it, it will use you." Those afternoons were my treasure. While my father was lost in card games and Uncle Richard was busy showing off, I was the only one who truly listened to my grandfather. He taught me how to read financial statements, how to invest wisely, and most importantly, how to be patient. "Success doesn't come overnight," he said. "It's like planting a tree. You have to water it every day, even if you don't see anything growing." I didn't know then that those lessons would become my weapons later, when my entire family turned against me. When I was 28, my grandfather was diagnosed with late-stage lung cancer. It was the biggest shock of my life. He was the only person in my family who truly understood me, who saw me as more than just a kid growing up in the shadow of my father and uncle. I still remember the day he called me to the hospital, his voice weak over the phone. "Sean, can you come right away?" I left a company meeting halfway through, driving like a madman to the hospital in Denver. When I walked into his room, he was lying there, frail, his skin ashen, but his eyes still as sharp as ever. He took my hand, his grip cold but firm as steel. "Sean," he whispered, "you're my hope. Don't let them destroy you." The they he referred to were my father and Uncle Richard. In his final months, they showed up at the hospital more often than ever. But I soon realized they weren't there to comfort him. They were there to pressure him into writing a will, to ensure they'd get the lion's share of his estate. I overheard their conversations through the hospital room door, calculated whispers, questions about shares and offshore accounts. My father, his voice trembling, asked, "Dad, have you decided yet? I need money to pay off debts." Uncle Richard was smoother, but I knew he was manipulating him. "Dad, Michael isn't reliable, but I'll use the money to expand the company, to honor the family name." I couldn't stand watching my grandfather, a man who once led a financial empire, be hounded by his own sons in his final days. I decided to act. One night after my father and uncle left the hospital, I secretly moved my grandfather to a medical facility in Boulder, a quiet place where no one knew he was there. I told the hospital staff I was the only family member allowed to visit. I took a leave of absence from work and spent all my time by his side. Those weeks, though painful, were the most precious of my life. My grandfather wasn't just a financial CEO with numbers and strategies that made my head spin. He was a storyteller, and through those stories I gradually came to understand the man he was. A man full of ambition but also deep emotional scars. In those final weeks at the Boulder Hospital, as his body weakened day by day, he opened up more than ever before. He told me about his youth, the years building his career, and the biggest mistakes of his life, how he raised my father, Michael, and my Uncle Richard. Those stories weren't just the final words of a man preparing to leave. They were a roadmap to help me understand why our family had become the chaotic mess it was today. My grandfather was born into a middle-class family in Chicago in the 1930s, during a time when America was grappling with the Great Depression. He used to tell me about those lean years, when his family survived on potatoes and bread. "Little Sean," he'd say in his deep voice, "do you know what real hunger feels like? It's not just a growling stomach. It makes you feel like you're nothing." That hunger drove him. He worked tirelessly, studied day and night, and earned a scholarship to a prestigious university. That was the turning point that led him to the world of finance. In the 1960s, my grandfather started working at a small investment firm in New York. With his sharp mind and remarkable perseverance, he quickly rose through the ranks. By the 1980s, he became the CEO of a major financial conglomerate, managing billions of dollars and earning respect in the industry. But that success came at a cost. He worked 16-hour days, flew between cities, and rarely had time for his family. My grandmother, whom he described as the light of his life, tried to keep the family together. But she passed away from a stroke when my father was only 7 and Uncle Richard was 5. I still remember the time my grandfather told me about the day she died. He was in London handling a major deal. When he got the call from the hospital, he flew back immediately, but it was too late. "I never forgave myself for not being there," he said, tears welling in his eyes. "She was everything, Sean, and I let her go alone." My grandmother's death left a void in him that could never be filled. He threw himself into work as a way to escape the pain, but that only distanced him further from his 2 young sons. My father and Uncle Richard grew up in wealth but lacked love. Feeling guilty for not spending enough time with them, my grandfather tried to compensate with money. He bought them everything they wanted: designer clothes, cars, and extravagant vacations. "I thought money would make them happy," he told me in the hospital, his voice heavy with regret. "But I was wrong. Money can't replace love, Sean. It only creates monsters." My father, Michael, the eldest son, was impulsive and easily swayed by emotions. My grandfather said he had a good heart, but he never taught him self-control. When my father turned 18, my grandfather gave him a brand new Mustang. Instead of cherishing it, my father used it to race off to Las Vegas, where he first set foot in a casino. I thought it was just youthful fun, my grandfather said. But then I realized Michael couldn't stop. He spent millions bailing my father out of gambling debts, from high-interest loans to credit card bills. Each time my father promised to change, my grandfather believed him, and the money flowed out like water. Uncle Richard was different. He was intelligent, charming, and a smooth talker. My grandfather once thought he'd be the one to take over his legacy. He invested in Richard's business ventures, from a real estate company to a chain of upscale restaurants. But Richard lacked discipline. He spent money recklessly, threw lavish parties, and bought extravagant items to show off. I gave him too much, my grandfather admitted. I thought I was helping him build a career, but I was only feeding his ego. These stories weren't just about the past. They were warnings. My grandfather wanted me to understand that money could destroy people if not used wisely. I failed with your father and uncle, he said, his voice breaking. But I believe you're different, Sean. You have a cool head and a good heart. Don't let money ruin you. I etched his words into my memory. The first few days at the Boulder hospital passed peacefully. But on the fourth day, my phone began buzzing incessantly. First, it was my father. I was sitting by my grandfather's bedside, watching him sleep under the dim hospital room lights, when my phone lit up with Dad. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the answer button, but finally picked up. His voice came through, urgent and suspicious. Sean, where are you? Where's Grandpa? I went to the Denver hospital and they said he's not there anymore. My heart pounded, but I tried to keep my voice steady. Dad, Grandpa needs rest. I moved him to a quieter place. Quieter? He practically shouted, his voice trembling with anger. Who do you think you are, Sean? I'm his son. I have a right to know where he is. I bit my lip, fighting the urge to spit out bitter words. I wanted to scream that he never cared about Grandpa, that he only showed up at the hospital to pressure him into writing a will. But I didn't. Instead, I said softly, Dad, Grandpa's exhausted. He needs peace. I'm just doing what's best for him. He roared, Don't lecture me about morals. What are you hiding him for, huh? You're trying to manipulate him, aren't you? I didn't respond. I just ended the call, my hands shaking. The phone slipped onto my lap and a wave of anger and pain surged in my chest. Less than an hour later, Uncle Richard called. Unlike my father, his voice was cold and smooth, like he was negotiating a business deal. Sean, hello, he began, his tone so sweet it gave me chills. I heard from Michael that you took Grandpa somewhere. Can you tell me what's going on? We're family, aren't we? I gripped the phone tightly, trying not to fall into his trap. Uncle Richard, I said evenly. Grandpa's being well cared for. I just want him to have his final days in peace. Peace? He scoffed, the sound sharp as a knife. Sean, do you think I'm stupid? You took him away without telling anyone. What are you planning? The will? The money? Blood rushed to my head. Uncle Richard, with all his hypocrisy, dared to accuse me of scheming. Uncle Richard, I said, my voice hardening, I'm not planning anything. I just want Grandpa to be left alone. I know why you and Dad were at the hospital. I heard everything. There was a moment of silence on the other end, as if he was caught off guard. Then he said, his voice lowering, Sean, you're making a big mistake. We're family. Don't complicate things. I didn't reply. I hung up, tossed the phone onto the chair, and buried my face in my hands. Those calls were just the beginning. Over the next few days, my father and uncle took turns calling, texting, even emailing. My father alternated between pleading and threatening. Sean, I'm your father. You can't treat me like this. Uncle Richard was more subtle, sending long messages filled with talk of family and responsibility. But I didn't waver. I knew if I revealed where Grandpa was, they'd show up immediately, bringing arguments and pressure. Grandpa didn't need that. He needed quiet, afternoons with birds chirping outside the window, and moments when I sat by his side reading the paper or simply holding his hand. One night, as I was making coffee in the hospital waiting room, my phone buzzed again. This time it was an unknown number. I answered, and a stranger's voice came through. "Sean Whitaker? I'm a friend of your father, Michael. He's very worried about your grandfather. Can you tell me where he is?" I froze. My father had even enlisted outsiders to pry information from me. "No," I said coldly. "If my father wants to know, he can talk to me directly." I hung up, but my heart was racing. I began to realize this fight wasn't just about money. It was about power, about who controlled my grandfather's legacy and his memory. I returned to my grandfather's room, sat by his bed, and looked at his gaunt but peaceful face. "Grandpa," I whispered, "I'm doing the right thing, aren't I?" He didn't answer, but I felt his hand gently squeeze mine, as if to say, "You're doing fine." That moment strengthened my resolve. I wouldn't let my father or uncle ruin his final days, and I wouldn't let them destroy his legacy. In the days that followed in Boulder, as my grandfather grew weaker, I began to see that his lessons weren't just theory. They were a compass to guide me through what lay ahead. I remembered one evening, when the fiery sunset streamed through the hospital window, and he held my hand and said, "Sean, when I'm gone, they'll come for you. Michael and Richard won't leave you alone. They'll want everything. You have to be strong." I nodded, though deep down I didn't believe my father and uncle could go that far. But I was wrong. My grandfather told me about the times he tried to fix things. When my father fell into gambling debt for the third time, my grandfather forced him into a rehab program. My father quit after 2 weeks. With Uncle Richard, my grandfather once cut off funding to force him to stand on his own, but Richard borrowed from shady sources, plunging his company into deeper debt. "I gave them too many chances," he said, "and each time they let me down." I could hear the pain in his voice. He wasn't just regretting his mistakes, but also what they had done to our family. "I don't want you to repeat my errors," he said. "If you inherit my legacy, use it to build something meaningful. Don't let it turn you into someone like them." My grandfather's final days passed peacefully, but I couldn't shake the growing anxiety. I knew his will would stir up a storm. He had made it clear to me that he was leaving everything: $3 million in cash, stocks, real estate, and $1 million in insurance to me. "I trust you to do the right thing," he said. But he also warned me about my father and uncle. "They won't accept it, Sean. They'll do anything to get the money. You have to be ready." I didn't want to believe my family could become my enemies, but deep down I knew he was right. Memories of my father staggering home from casinos with bloodshot eyes, and of Uncle Richard with his fake smile and empty promises, came flooding back. I began to feel an invisible weight pressing down on my shoulders. My grandfather's legacy wasn't just money. It was a burden, a challenge I wasn't sure I could overcome. And so, the inevitable came. The day my grandfather passed away, a light rain fell in Boulder. I sat by his bedside, holding his hand, feeling his faint breaths grow slower. When the machines let out a long beep signaling his heart had stopped, I didn't cry. I just sat there, still gripping his hand, as if letting go would mean he'd vanish forever. But then I knew I had to act. My grandfather had entrusted me with a responsibility, and I couldn't let him down. I gathered my courage to call my father. The phone rang a few times before he picked up. "Dad," I said, my voice trembling. "Grandpa passed away this morning." There was a long silence on the other end. Then my father asked, his voice cold, "Where? Where did you hide him, Sean?" I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "He was in Boulder. I moved him there so he could rest." My father growled, "Just you wait. You'll pay for this." I didn't argue. I only said, "Dad, Grandpa wanted peace. I did what he wanted." I hung up before he could say more. The call with Uncle Richard was even worse. He didn't shout, but his voice was sharp as a blade. "Sean, you've gone too far," he said. "You think you can hide Grandpa from the family? You'll pay a price for this." A chill ran down my spine, but I didn't let him see my fear. "Uncle Richard, I only did what was best for Grandpa. I'll see you at his funeral." He gave a mocking laugh. "Oh, we'll meet, Sean, and we'll talk about all of this." I knew all of this wasn't just about Grandpa's death. It was about the money, the will, the legacy that he and my father believed they were entitled to. My father and Uncle Richard quickly made arrangements for the funeral. They chose a grand church in downtown Denver, a place I knew Grandpa never liked. He had told me he wanted a simple funeral, with just family and a few close friends. But my father and uncle turned it into an ostentatious event. I arrived at the church on the day of the funeral feeling like a stranger in my own family. My father stood at the entrance, dressed in a black suit, but his eyes were bloodshot, as if he'd been drinking all night. Uncle Richard, on the other hand, looked impeccable in a tailored suit, flashing his fake smile and shaking hands like a politician. The atmosphere in the church was stifling, not from the incense or prayers, but from the resentment radiating from my father and uncle. They barely looked at me, but I could feel their gazes sharp as knives. During the service, my father stood up to say a few words about Grandpa, but his speech was full of cliches about a wonderful father that I knew he didn't truly feel. Uncle Richard spoke about the Whitaker family legacy as if he had contributed anything to it. I sat in the back row, clenching my fists, trying to suppress my anger. They weren't talking about Grandpa, the man who taught me about patience and responsibility. They were talking about what they wanted: money, prestige, power. After the funeral, at the reception in a luxurious hotel, my father pulled me into a corner. "Sean," he said, his voice low but menacing, "you think you can hide Grandpa from me and take everything? This isn't over." I looked straight into his eyes, searching for a trace of the father I once loved. "Dad," I said, "I didn't hide him to take anything. I just wanted him to have peace. If you want to talk about the will, we can meet with the lawyer." He shook his head, his face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this, Sean," he said, then turned away. Uncle Richard approached me later with his familiar smile but cold eyes. "Sean, we need to talk," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder as if we were close friends. "You've made a mess of things, but we can fix it. Bring out the will and we'll split everything evenly. Fair for everyone." I brushed his hand off. "Uncle Richard, Grandpa made his decision. I'll honor his wishes." He tilted his head, his smile fading. "You're playing a dangerous game, Sean," he said. "Family is family. Don't force me to do things I don't want to." I left the reception feeling like I'd just walked out of a battlefield. I knew my father and uncle wouldn't stop. They would do anything to get their hands on Grandpa's legacy, and I would have to fight to protect it, not just for the money, but for what he taught me, for the values he wanted me to carry forward. As I drove back to my apartment, the rain still falling, I felt a profound loneliness. But I also felt strength from my grandfather's words. "You're my hope, Sean. Don't let them destroy you." About a month after the funeral, on a cold Colorado morning, I received an email from my grandfather's law firm. It was a prestigious firm housed in a gleaming glass building in downtown Denver. As I stepped into the meeting room, my heart pounded. I wasn't sure I was ready to face what was coming, but I knew I couldn't run from it. My father and Uncle Richard were already there, seated on opposite sides of a long wooden table, the atmosphere thick with tension like the calm before a battle. My father wore a wrinkled shirt, his eyes bloodshot as if he'd spent another night at a casino. Uncle Richard, in contrast, looked like he'd stepped out of an ad campaign, dressed in an expensive gray suit with a confident smile. But I knew that smile was a facade. They didn't look at me, but I could feel the tension radiating from them like two predators waiting for the right moment to pounce. My grandfather's lawyer, Mr. Daniel Harper, was an older man with silver hair and a deep, clear voice. He sat at the head of the table, opened a thick file, and began to read. "This is the last will and testament of Mr. Robert Whitaker, executed on August 15, 2022 in Boulder, Colorado," he said, his voice steady but commanding. I glanced at my father and uncle. My father clenched his fists while Uncle Richard sat upright, his eyes fixed on Mr. Harper as if trying to read the words before they were spoken. When Mr. Harper reached the part about the distribution of assets, the room grew even more stifling. The entirety of my estate, including $3 million in cash, shares in various companies, real estate, and $1 million in life insurance, shall be transferred to my grandson, Sean Whitaker, to manage and use at his discretion. I heard my father let out a sharp breath. Uncle Richard didn't move, but I saw his hand grip the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. Mr. Harper continued reading, but I could barely hear him over the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I knew my father and uncle were staring at me, and their gazes weren't those of family. They were filled with hostility. When Mr. Harper finished, my father shot up from his chair, its legs scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "What?" he shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "This kid? What has he done to deserve it? I'm his son. I'm the one who should get it." He pointed at me, his face flushed. "What did you do, Sean? You manipulated Grandpa, didn't you? When he was weak, you were there, whispering in his ear." Blood rushed to my head, but I tried to stay calm as my grandfather had taught me. "Dad," I said, my voice low but firm, "I didn't manipulate anyone. Grandpa chose me because he trusted me. I only did what he wanted." My father let out a bitter laugh. "Trusted you? A lowly engineer? You think you're worthy of $4 million? I'm your father, Sean. I have rights." I didn't respond. I just looked at him, searching for a trace of the father I once loved, but all I saw was desperation and greed. Uncle Richard, as usual, was more calculated. He stood, placing a hand on my father's shoulder as if to calm him, but his eyes locked onto mine, cold as ice. "Sean," he said, his voice smooth but laced with menace, "you've made things very complicated. Grandpa clearly wasn't in his right mind when he wrote this will. You were with him, isolating him from the family. I hate to say this, but it looks like you took advantage of his condition." Anger surged inside me, but I held it back. "Uncle Richard," I said, "I didn't isolate Grandpa. I took him to a quiet place so he could rest, because you and Dad wouldn't stop pressuring him about money." I heard everything. Uncle Richard's face tightened, but he quickly regained his composure. "You're misunderstanding, Sean. I only want what's best for the family, but if you insist on keeping this money, we'll have to settle this another way." Mr. Harper, still seated at the head of the table, interjected, "This will was legally notarized and executed when Mr. Robert was fully lucid. If you gentlemen wish to contest it, you may file a claim in court, but I warn you it will be time-consuming and costly." My father glared at Mr. Harper, then turned to me. "You'll regret this, Sean," he said before storming out of the room, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. After the will reading, my life became a nightmare. My father and uncle wouldn't leave me alone. My phone buzzed constantly with their calls and texts. My father alternated between pleading and threatening. One night he called at midnight, his voice slurred from drinking. "Sean, you don't know how much I'm suffering," he said. "I owe money, a lot of money. If you don't share, I'll lose everything." I tried to keep my voice steady. "Dad, I'm sorry you're struggling, but Grandpa made his decision. I have to respect him." He shouted, "Respect? You're an ungrateful son. You're stealing from me." I hung up, my heart heavy. I didn't want to hurt my father, but I couldn't let him manipulate me. Uncle Richard was more sophisticated. He sent long messages filled with talk of family and responsibility. One message read, "Sean, I know you're trying to do the right thing, but you have to think of the whole family. Grandpa wouldn't want us divided. Meet with me and we can negotiate fairly." I knew he didn't want to negotiate. He wanted me to give up the inheritance. I replied briefly, "Uncle, I'll follow Grandpa's wishes." He didn't respond, but I sensed danger in his silence. Things got worse when they started attacking me on social media. The first posts appeared just days after the will reading. An anonymous account called me a legacy thief and an ungrateful grandson. Other posts, which I was sure came from Uncle Richard, spun a story about a grandson who isolated his grandfather to seize his fortune. I didn't care much about social media, but those words still stung. They didn't just want the money, they wanted to destroy me. The breaking point came when my father showed up at my apartment. I opened the door to find him standing there, his shirt soaked with sweat, his face haggard. "Sean," he said, his voice hoarse, "you have to stop this. Give me the money and this will all be over." I looked at him, feeling a deep sadness. "Dad," I said, "I can't. Grandpa chose me because he knew you and Uncle would destroy everything. I have to honor him." He slammed his hand against the doorframe, his face contorted. "You're not my son," he said, then turned and left. I closed the door, leaned against the wall, and felt my heart shatter. I began reviewing all of my grandfather's documents, contracts, accounts, and notes he'd left behind. I found a file Mr. Harper had sent me detailing the money my grandfather had spent on my father and uncle over the years. Over $10 million to pay off my father's gambling debts and fund Uncle Richard's failed ventures. The numbers stunned me. My grandfather had given them so much, yet they still wanted more. I realized this inheritance wasn't just money. It was my grandfather's final test for me. He wanted me to prove I was different from them. I called Mr. Harper, asking him to prepare everything to protect the will. "They won't stop," I said. He agreed. "They're desperate, Sean. But we have evidence and we have the law. You just hold your ground." I nodded, though only over the phone. I knew I couldn't show weakness. Not for the money, but for my grandfather. For what he believed in me. One weekend afternoon, as I sat in my small apartment in Colorado Springs checking work emails to distract myself from the family drama, my phone buzzed. It was my father. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the decline button, but I finally answered. His voice came through, different from before, not angry, not drunk, but soft, almost pleading. "Sean," he said, "I know things have gone too far. I don't want us to stay like this. You're my son. We're family." I stayed silent, waiting. I knew my father never called just to say sentimental things. Sure enough, he continued, "Your Uncle Richard and I want to invite you to a barbecue at my place. Just a small gathering to mend things. Will you come?" A chill ran down my spine. Mending wasn't a word in my father's or uncle's vocabulary, but I was curious, or perhaps naive, wanting to know what they were plotting. "I'll think about it," I said, keeping my tone neutral. My father replied quickly, "Don't think too long, Sean. This is a chance to start over. Sunday, 3 p.m. We'll be waiting." He hung up before I could say more. I sank into the sofa, staring out the window where the sunlight faded over Denver's buildings. I knew this wasn't an ordinary barbecue. My father and uncle were setting a trap, though I didn't yet know what it was. I thought of my grandfather, of the times he taught me to read situations, like when he said, "Sean, when someone's too kind, be careful. They usually want something." I decided to go, but not unprepared. I called Mr. Harper, telling him about the invitation. "I think they're trying to pressure me into giving in on the will," I said. He agreed. "They're desperate, Sean. Be cautious. Don't sign anything, and if you can, record the conversation." I nodded, feeling a bit more confident. I'd play their game, but on my terms. Sunday arrived, the Colorado Springs sky clear, but I felt a storm brewing. I drove over an hour to Denver through winding roads lined with pine forests and rocky hills. My father's house was in the suburbs, a 2-story log home my grandfather had bought for him years ago. As I parked in the driveway, I noticed several cars, Uncle Richard's sleek Bentley, an unfamiliar SUV, and an old pickup truck I didn't recognize. My heart beat faster. This wasn't a small gathering. I stepped out of the car carrying a small briefcase with documents Mr. Harper had prepared. Evidence of the money my grandfather had spent on my father and uncle over the years. I also turned on my phone's recording function and slipped it into my pocket. As I approached the door, my father opened it, flashing an awkward smile. "Sean, you came," he said, clapping my shoulder harder than necessary. "Come in, everyone's waiting." I nodded, but inside I felt like I was walking into a lion's den. Inside, the air was stifling despite the open windows. I saw Uncle Richard standing near the backyard grill talking to two men I didn't know. One wore a suit looking like a lawyer, while the other had a rough demeanor like a debt collector. My cousins Emily and Jake, Uncle Richard's kids, sat at the dining table but avoided my gaze. What stunned me was the presence of Mr. Carter, an old neighbor I'd feared as a child. He used to yell at me for being noisy or threaten to call the police if I ran through his yard. Now he sat there, sipping a beer, smirking at me. My skin crawled. Why had they invited him? My father led me to the backyard where a table was set with burgers, salad, and beer, but no one was eating. Everyone watched me as if I were the centerpiece of a play whose script I didn't know. Uncle Richard approached, his familiar smile plastered on. "Sean, so glad you came," he said, handing me a beer. I took it but didn't open it. "Thanks, Uncle," I said evenly. "So what's today about? Mending the family?" He laughed, but his eyes were cold. "Exactly, Sean. We've had too many misunderstandings. Today we'll sort everything out like adults." He clapped his hands, signaling everyone to sit at the table. I took a seat at the end, feeling like prey surrounded by predators. My father sat across from me, staring at his plate but gripping his knife tightly. Emily and Jake kept their heads down as if they didn't want to be there. Mr. Carter, seated next to me, muttered, "You've grown up, Sean, but still a troublemaker, huh?" I didn't respond, keeping my eyes on Uncle Richard, waiting. The barbecue started with meaningless small talk about the weather, football, fake family memories no one truly cherished. But the tension was palpable, growing thicker by the minute. Finally, Uncle Richard stood, raising his beer. "Everyone," he said, his voice booming like a seasoned speaker, "we're here today for family, for my father, Robert, who left a great legacy. But that legacy is under threat due to misunderstandings and selfishness." He looked directly at me when he said, "selfishness." My face flushed, but I stayed silent. My father spoke next, his voice trembling. "Sean, I know I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes, but you can't keep all that money. It belongs to the family, to all of us." He looked at me, his eyes bloodshot. "You're tearing this family apart, Sean." I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. "Dad, Grandpa chose me. I'm not trying to destroy anything. I'm just honoring his wishes." Uncle Richard cut in, his tone sweet but calculated. "Sean, we don't want to fight. We want a fair solution. I've prepared an agreement." He gestured to the man in the suit, clearly a lawyer, who pulled out a stack of papers. "Sign this and we'll split the estate evenly. No lawsuits, no trouble. We'll be a family again." I looked at the papers, my heart pounding. This was the trap. If I signed, I'd lose everything, not just the money, but what my grandfather believed in me. I glanced around the table. Emily and Jake kept their heads down, but I saw Emily's hands clenched as if she was ashamed. Mr. Carter smirked, enjoying the drama. My father's eyes were a mix of pleading and menace. I knew if I didn't sign, they wouldn't let me be. "I need time to review it," I said, buying time. Uncle Richard shook his head. "Sean, we don't have time. Sign now, or we'll sue. And trust me, you'll lose." Mr. Carter chimed in, his voice gravelly. "Listen to your uncle, Sean. Don't make this worse." The pressure was crushing, but I thought of my grandfather, of the afternoons he taught me about patience, about never giving in to temptation. I stood, opening my briefcase. "Before I decide," I said, my voice firm, "I want everyone to know a few things." I pulled out the documents Mr. Harper had prepared, detailed records of the money my grandfather had spent on my father and uncle over 2 decades. "Grandpa gave you both over $10 million, I said, looking straight at them. $5 million to pay off Dad's gambling debts, from loan sharks to Vegas casinos. Another $5 million to fund Uncle Richard's projects, from a bankrupt real estate firm to a restaurant chain that never opened." The air around the table grew deathly still. My father's face paled, his hands trembling. Uncle Richard froze, his smile gone. I continued, my voice clear. Grandpa gave you everything, but you still want more. I'm not here to steal from anyone. I'm here to protect what he built. I locked eyes with Uncle Richard. If you want to sue, go ahead, but I have proof and I'll fight to the end. I placed the documents on the table like a declaration of war, the pages filled with figures, signatures, and dates, undeniable evidence of my grandfather's generosity and disappointment, sat there like a ticking bomb. I'm not here to take anything, I said, staring into Uncle Richard's eyes, once charming but now cold and calculating. I'm here to protect what Grandpa built. He gave you every chance, but you threw them away. Now you want to take what he left from me. I won't let that happen. Uncle Richard leaned forward, hands braced on the table as if trying to intimidate me with his presence. You think you're clever, don't you, Sean? He said, his voice low but sharp. You think those papers will protect you? You're taking on your own family. I didn't flinch. Do what you want, I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. But I have proof and I won't back down. Not today, not ever. In that moment, I felt as if my grandfather were standing behind me, his hand on my shoulder, as he used to do when teaching me about patience. But in reality, I was alone, facing a table full of hostile stares. Emily, my cousin, looked up, her eyes glistening with tears as if torn between loyalty to her father and shame for what he'd done. Jake, her brother, kept his head down, his fingers crushing the beer can until it dented. Uncle Richard's lawyer, his face flushed with embarrassment, flipped through the documents frantically, hoping to find a loophole. But there was none. The numbers didn't lie. Mr. Carter, the old neighbor I'd once feared, stood abruptly, knocking over his beer bottle. The smell of beer mingled with the scent of cold grilled meat. You're an arrogant little punk, he growled, pointing at me. You think you can take down your whole family with those papers? I looked him in the eye, feeling no fear for the first time. I'm not taking anyone down, Mr. Carter, I said, and you have no say here. He muttered something, then stormed off, his heavy boots thudding on the wooden floor like war drums. My father, who I'd hoped would say something, anything to defuse the situation, sat silently, his head bowed. I saw his shoulders tremble as if holding back tears, but I wasn't sure if it was shame or anger. Dad, I said, my voice softening, I don't want to hurt you, but I have to do what's right for Grandpa. He didn't look up, just shook his head as if I'd betrayed him again. Uncle Richard straightened, adjusting his tie, trying to regain his usual confidence. You think you've won? He said, his voice low and menacing. This game's just beginning. He signaled for his lawyer and kids to leave. Emily gave me one last look, her eyes seeming to apologize, but she said nothing. Jake followed his father silently. The lawyer hurriedly gathered his papers, avoiding my gaze. They left, leaving me and my father in the backyard, surrounded by a mess of cold food and unresolved accusations. I stood there, my breathing slowing but my heart still pounding. I dismantled their trap, but I knew the cost. My father looked up, his eyes no longer angry but empty. You're not my son, he whispered, then stood and walked into the house, leaving me alone in the yard. The door slammed shut, a final punctuation on the faint hope that we could still be a family. After the tense barbecue in Colorado Springs, I knew my father and uncle wouldn't give up easily. Uncle Richard, with his cunning and resources, led the legal battle. Just weeks later, I received a court notice that he had filed a lawsuit, alleging my grandfather was not of sound mind when he wrote the will and that I had isolated him to manipulate his wishes. My father, Michael, joined the suit, though I knew he lacked the money or energy to pursue it alone. Uncle Richard was clearly the mastermind, using his wealth and connections to drag things out. The following months were a nightmare. I had to attend hearings, answer repetitive questions from Uncle Richard's lawyers, and watch them try to tarnish my reputation. They even hired a psychologist to argue that my grandfather was psychologically influenced while in Boulder with me. But Mr. Harper, with his calm expertise, countered every accusation. He presented medical records proving my grandfather was fully lucid, along with personal notes my grandfather had written, clearly explaining why he chose me as his heir. One note, read aloud in court, choked me up. "Sean is the only one who understands the value of what I built. I trust he will use this legacy to create something meaningful, not to serve greed." Each hearing was a mental ordeal. I sat in the front row, feeling Uncle Richard's icy stare from across the room. My father rarely looked at me, but when he did, I saw disappointment and pain in his eyes. I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't abandon what my grandfather had entrusted to me. Some nights I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had the strength to keep going. But then I remembered my grandfather, the afternoons he taught me about patience and standing firm under pressure. "You're my hope, Sean," he'd said, and I couldn't let him down. Finally, on a crisp fall day in 2023, the judge delivered the final ruling. My grandfather's will was upheld as legally valid, and Uncle Richard's claims were dismissed. I stood outside the courthouse, breathing in the cold Denver air, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. Mr. Harper shook my hand, a rare smile breaking across his face. "Congratulations, Sean," he said. "Now it's up to you." I nodded, but inside I knew this victory wasn't the end. It was the start of a bigger journey, one to build the legacy my grandfather had envisioned. With $4 million in my hands, I felt a heavy but inspiring responsibility. My grandfather had said, "Money isn't the goal. It's a tool to build something lasting." I decided to use the inheritance to carry forward his dream, not just preserving what he'd built, but creating a positive impact for the community. I wanted his legacy to live on, not in bank accounts, but in meaningful actions. I started by contacting Ethan, a close friend from college who now ran a green tech startup in Boulder. Ethan was a talented engineer, passionate about renewable energy and environmental protection. I remembered our dorm room debates about how technology could change the world. "Sean," he'd said, "if we had the money, we could build clean energy systems for all of Colorado." Back then, I'd laughed, thinking it was a pipe dream. But now, with my grandfather's legacy, that dream became reality. I met Ethan at a small Boulder cafe where the scent of roast coffee blended with the fresh mountain air. I laid out my grandfather's documents on the table, explaining my plan: to establish an investment fund to support green tech startups in Colorado. "I want to use Grandpa's money to create something sustainable," I said. "Not just for the environment, but to create jobs, support communities, and carry on what he taught me." Ethan looked at me, his eyes lighting up. "Sean, are you serious? This is huge." We spent hours brainstorming, sketching out plans for a fund called Whitaker Green Ventures. Over the next few months, Ethan and I worked tirelessly. We hired a small team of financial experts and environmental engineers to evaluate potential projects. I invested $2 million of the inheritance into the fund, focusing on companies developing solar energy, water recycling systems, and energy storage technology. One of our first investments was a startup in Fort Collins working on recycled material batteries for renewable energy. When I visited their facility and saw young engineers working with burning passion, I felt like my grandfather was smiling somewhere. This was what he wanted. Money used to build the future, not to feed greed. Beyond the investment fund, I wanted to honor my grandfather in a more personal way. He told me that education was the key to changing lives, as a scholarship had lifted him out of poverty in 1930s Chicago. I decided to establish a scholarship fund in his name, the Robert Whitaker Scholarship Fund, to support underprivileged students studying finance or technology. I allocated $500,000 from the inheritance to launch the fund, partnering with a Denver university to manage it. On the day of the scholarship fund's launch, I stood before a group of students and faculty, feeling as nervous as my first company presentation. My grandfather, Robert Whitaker, taught me that money isn't the goal, but a tool, I said, my voice slightly shaky. This fund isn't just about paying tuition. It's a way to continue his legacy, one of responsibility, hard work, and creating lasting value. When I awarded the first scholarship to a young woman named Maria, who grew up in a slum and dreamed of becoming a financial analyst, her eyes shimmered with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "I won't let you down." I smiled, but inside I thought, "No, Maria, you're making my grandfather proud." Though I'd won the lawsuit, my father and Uncle Richard didn't entirely vanish from my life. Uncle Richard, after losing the case, continued his smear campaign on social media, posting bitter rants about the injustice of the will. I tried to ignore them, but each post felt like a small knife, reminding me our family was broken. My father, meanwhile, fell silent, no longer calling or texting. I heard he'd returned to Las Vegas, sinking deeper into gambling, and it broke my heart. I wanted to help him, but I knew I couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. One day I received an email from Emily, my cousin, Uncle Richard's daughter. "Sean," she wrote, "I'm sorry for being part of that barbecue. I didn't want to hurt you. My dad, he was wrong. I just want to say I'm proud of what you're doing with Grandpa's money." Reading her email, I felt a flicker of warmth amidst the cold storm of our family. I replied, inviting her to Denver to talk. When we met, she told me Uncle Richard had gone completely bankrupt, losing his mansion and company. She also said my father had entered a gambling rehab program, but no one knew if he'd stick with it. I decided to set up a small trust fund worth $200,000 to support my father and uncle if they needed it, but with strict conditions. They had to participate in recovery programs or financial restructuring. I didn't want to see them destitute, but I couldn't let them exploit my goodwill. Emily thanked me, but I saw sadness in her eyes. "Our family shouldn't have ended up like this," she said. I nodded, saying nothing. I knew she was right, but I also knew I couldn't change the past. Looking back over the past year, I realized my grandfather's legacy wasn't just money. It was the lessons he taught me about patience, responsibility, and using resources to create value. Whitaker Green Ventures had funded 5 startups, creating over 50 jobs in Colorado. The Robert Whitaker Scholarship Fund had supported 10 students, and I hoped that number would grow each year. I wasn't richer in money, but I felt richer in purpose. One evening, standing on my apartment balcony looking down at the South Platte River glittering under the city lights, I thought of my grandfather. "I'm doing the right thing, aren't I, Grandpa?" I whispered. I didn't hear a reply, but I felt a deep sense of peace. I knew he'd be proud, and I knew that though the road ahead was long, I'd begun the journey he'd always wanted, a journey to build a legacy not just for myself, but for those who would come after,